Hello, my name is Lily Rodriguez, and today I am filming this video for my abnormal psychology class. This video is to bring awareness to a subject dealing with the field of abnormal psychology. And if you don't know what abnormal psychology is, it deals with mental health, mental illness, how people who live with mental illness are affected, and the different kind of treatments for mental illness. And as I was doing my research for this project, I was going through different subjects, and one just kept popping up in the back of my mind. And that's how I realized this is what I definitely wanted to bring awareness to for this project, because it's something important to me, and I think more people should talk about it because it's just so important to me. I grew up and I still live in a small rural town in the thumb of Michigan. And I would say that living in a small town like this has its pros and cons, as living any place does. You know pretty much everyone, and it's decently safe for the most part. And it has, that small town charm. However, this can also lead into one of the downfalls of living in a small town. People who are deemed different, whether it be by societal standards or by the standards of people who live in small areas like this, tend to stick out and be outcasted. And this would greatly affect people who live with mental illness because their mental illness causes them to act in a way that would not be deemed normal. The stigma of having a mental illness and the even greater stigma of seeking out treatment for mental health issues, in my experience, was magnified by living in my small rural town. Not only that, but even getting access to mental health treatments and services was not easy. Rural areas face obstacles such as not having insurance accepted, having to pay for having to pay for services that are not covered by insurance, and the lack of clinics close by. Rural areas are far removed from metropolitan areas and leave people facing long drives or having to travel long ways just to get to an appointment. The lack of access to mental health care, the stigma surrounding it, and perhaps even the prevalence of mental illness in rural areas is something that is just not often talked about in the conversation of mental health in America, and a topic that is just very personal to me because I live in an area like this. In my hometown, we have the western branch of a well-known mental health organization in St. Clair County, located just outside village limits. However, everyone I know who has tried to get help here, receive any kind of treatment, or get therapy through them were denied for whatever reason. My brother, who suffers from a condition that leaves him developmentally delayed, was denied therapy here because they didn't accept the type of insurance we have. When I was in high school, I sadly had a classmate pass away due to suicide, and his father swore up and down that he tried to get him help from this organization in the weeks leading up to his passing, and that he was denied because they weren't accepting new patients at the time because they were overwhelmed by the amount of people who needed help. Another friend, during the same time after this classmate had passed, tried to get therapy to help, deal with the trauma of losing a friend, and they were turned away. It's important to note that even though all these people were aware of the resources they had available to them, they were still denied for whatever reason. And this is just one real life example from my own life, and I'm sure it's the case for many others. Something that I noticed when I was doing my research for this video is that I could find almost no information that can compare the prevalence of mental illness in a rural area versus suburban areas or urban areas or metropolitan areas that were specific to the United States. And this is very concerning to me because there is such a huge difference between living in a rural area and an urban area. Where I live, we're nearly 30 miles from the nearest hospital and even 30 minutes away from the nearest Walmart. Not having resources close by or feeling like you're isolated or cut off from the rest of the world has to have some sort of bearing on the human mind, and I hope one day that is more deeply studied, deeply researched to see how that affects people's mental health. According to the Rural Health Information Hub, there are several barriers that a person might experience trying to receive mental health treatment in a rural area. These include lack of affordability, lack of transportation, the stigma surrounding receiving treatment, and even lack of anonymity, because small rural towns like the one I live in have such small populations that everyone kind of knows everything about everyone, unfortunately, and word gets out fast. In a journal article done to research mental health in rural Kentucky, they found that despite higher rates of suicide and depression and drug-related deaths, rural Americans still receive less mental health treatment than those living in urban areas. And I know that there, is a pretty big difference between, rural Appalachian Kentucky and the rural Midwest in terms of being able, to receive transportation outside of these areas. But these are still rural areas, and the people who live in them are going to have more similarities than differences. The same journal article also highlighted the fact that many people who were living in rural Kentucky had found their depression so normal and comfortable and didn't necessarily believe that they needed treatment or that they even deserved treatment for their depression. Article published in the Journal for Rural Health states that residents of rural communities are more likely to experience socialization relative to those living in urban communities. And this is likely due to the lack of population in rural areas, and especially in terms of population density. From my experience, where I live, it's a lot of farmland, so people are way more spread out than they would be in an urban area. The same article also states that individuals in rural communities are at an increased risk for suicide, and that the COVID-19 pandemic likely exacerbated and increased suicide rates. And there was one thing in this article that was mentioned that I hadn't really thought of before doing research for this project, and it was that suicide in rural communities correlates with access to firearms, and that firearms are the leading means of suicide in rural communities. And it shocked me that I had never really thought about this before, because almost everyone I know owns a gun or lives with someone who does own a gun. Hunting is such a big part of living out in the country and part of country life. So having a shotgun or a gun at home for hunting is very commonplace. So much so that even at my high school, at nights during the fall, they offered a gun safety class and a hunter's safety course. They would talk about how to clean a gun safely and how to make sure it didn't fire accidentally, but there was no mention of guns being used to harm oneself on purpose or to commit suicide. And I think it's a topic that isn't really thought of in this context, because most people think of hunting rifles or shotguns being used only for hunting in these areas. And I think most people, including myself, just haven't thought of it that way. And there's a greater need of awareness for this issue for sure. In both the journal article published for the Journal of Rural Health that I mentioned earlier, and another journal article published by JAMA Health Forum, mentioned that many people who lived in rural areas were deterred from getting help for their mental health because of the stigma surrounding having a mental illness. And this is likely due to the fact that they believe they might face discrimination because they have a mental illness. However, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, 52.9 million adults in the United States suffered from a mental illness, and this equates to nearly 21% or 1/5 of adults in the US. This is a huge population of people. Despite this, mental illness is still heavily stigmatized in rural areas because the people who live in them simply are not aware that mental illness is a normal thing to experience in a lifetime. The lack of awareness in rural communities about this sort of thing hinders people from getting help. If there was more normalization of mental health through awareness and conversation in rural communities like mine, it would decrease the stigma and allow people to feel like they were worthy or comfortable getting help. These are conversations that are just so important and need to be had. It's important to note that adults who live in rural communities are not the only ones that suffer. The National Institute for Mental Health also found that 8.3% of adolescents suffer specifically from depression, not even all mental illnesses, just depression. In a study that conducted in rural areas of both Kentucky and Iowa, which focused specifically on adolescents, people who are younger than 18, that lived in rural communities, found that 34% of their sample had a high level of depressive symptoms. This was also accompanied by 9% of these young people seriously considering suicide in the past year, with both boys and girls experiencing these equally. As I mentioned earlier, there are several barriers to getting mental health treatment when living in rural areas, such as lack of mental health professionals, having to travel a long distance for treatments, cost, facing the stigma of having a mental illness, or even lack of anonymity. There has been one proposed resolution to these issues that for people living within rural communities, and that is digital methods such as telehealth to treat mental illness. This could be a meeting with a mental health professional over the phone or on a face-to-face digital call such as Zoom or Skype. This at face value does seem like it would be a good fix to the lack of in-person treatments in areas like this. However, according to a survey published by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, 21% or 1/5 of adults who live in rural communities said that they don't have the high-speed internet that would be needed for calls like this. From experience living where I live, I would say that my internet goes out 3 to 4 days out of the week, and the days that I have it is not very fast, and it's not very reliable. I also don't know if this is the case for all rural communities, but at least where I live in certain areas, you only have the choice between 1 or 2 different providers. And a lot of the times, if you call a different provider to see if they have service in your area, they'll turn you away because they don't have a cable where you live, and they're probably not going to put one in. There's also, like many other issues dealing with mental health, a lack of awareness about the option of telehealth appointments or treatments. While there has been some awareness due to the pandemic bringing in-person health visits in general to a halt, older generations who are not as technically inclined as younger generations don't really know about this option. And there needs to be more advertisement about these options, more awareness brought to the option of telehealth therapy and mental health treatments for those who are living in rural communities for sure. However, this can't be the end all be all treatment for rural communities. It's like putting a band-aid on a bullet hole. It's a good treatment, but there needs to be an increase of access to in-person mental health treatments and professionals as well. I chose this topic to bring awareness to because I think people in rural communities are usually left behind in conversations that talk about mental health and mental health access and mental illness. I think that there needs to be a more in-depth research on how the differences between living in a rural community versus living in a suburban or an urban area affects mental health, because the reality is that life in these areas is just so different for the people living within them. Where you live has such a large bearing on how you view the world and the culture you grow up in. So of course there's going to be differences in how mental health should be treated and how, the prevalence of different mental illnesses and stuff like that. And I'm so glad that mental health is becoming a bigger topic of conversation in American society and, just in the world in general, but there needs to be a bigger conversation held for rural communities as well. There's such a lack of awareness about mental health issues in my town and in other towns like it. There also should be an increased awareness about the lack of mental health treatments and professionals available in these areas, and greater research on how to increase access to these things. Because yes, telehealth is an option, but with such a great lack of access to internet in rural areas, this can't be the only option available. I'm hoping that in the future, as the conversation of mental health issues in America continues to grow, research will be done on how to help people who live in rural communities like I do, because we're simply just getting left behind. There needs to be more help for people living out in areas like I do. I hope that more people become aware of these issues in these areas, and that things become better for people who suffer from mental health issues and mental illness in areas like this. Thank you for watching this video.